In Battle for Azeroth, Blizzard is making a pretty major change to the Blood Elf Arcane Torrent racial. This change isn't a matter of why are they doing it, the answer to that is because Arcane Torrent is fucking overpowered, but rather it's a question of why did it take so long for everyone to realize how overpowered Arcane Torrent is. Arcane Torrent has existed in the form it currently is in ever since Wrath of the Lich King, and yet it is only in Legion that it became recognized as extremely powerful and almost mandatory for high-end PvE and PvP content. The racial's sudden moment of popularity and its imminent rework have a lot of people wondering when and why Arcane Torrent became so ungodly powerful. Today, I wanted to talk about that and examine how a racial that came out in Burning Crusade managed to only deserve a rework in Battle for Azeroth. So, let's begin. So about 400 years ago in 2007, World of Warcraft releases its second expansion, the Burning Crusade. In this expansion comes the Blood Elf race along with their racial abilities. One of their abilities was, of course, Arcane Torrent, but there was a second racial that not many people remember anymore. That racial was Mana Tap. Now, Arcane Torrent at this time did basically what it does now. It was an AoE silence that restored some of your mana or other resources, but Arcane Torrent was directly linked with Mana Tap, in that originally you needed to gain 3 stacks of Mana Tap in order to unleash an Arcane Torrent. But let me explain. Mana Tap needed to be used against an enemy with mana. That means no warriors or rogues or manaless monsters. I believe, but I'm not certain as I can't specifically recall or find information on this, but I do believe you had to use it on a creature or player that had both a mana bar and had mana remaining, so you couldn't cast it on a mage with 0 mana, or else you wouldn't gain a stack. But anyways, the point is that you needed to essentially use Mana Tap 3 times in order to activate the use of Arcane Torrent. Mana Tap had a 30-second cooldown, which meant that it took at least 1 minute and 30 seconds to get all 3 stacks, and the Mana Tap buff itself only had a 10-minute duration. So if you didn't get all 3 stacks within 10 minutes, then you'd have to start all over again. Basically, Mana Tap gated the use of Arcane Torrent. You couldn't use Arcane Torrent on demand up until Wrath of the Lich King, when Mana Tap was removed from the game in patch 3.0.2. The removal was actually partly to do with lore reasons as well as gameplay mechanics, as Blizzard had decided that it was dumb and a bit clunky to force Blood Elves to use Mana Tap 3 times before being able to use Arcane Torrent. And from a lore perspective, the end of the Burning Crusade saw the restoration of the Blood Elves' sacred font of magical power, the sun that we all remember well.
Remember the sun well.
Blood Elves, from a lore standpoint, no longer needed to suck the mana from things. Blizzard, however, didn't exactly realize what they had just done for Blood Elf players. They removed the lock and key that prevented Blood Elves from on-demand silencing enemies in an AoE around them. For the longest time, it seemed like almost no one fully appreciated how goddamn significant that this was. I think it was largely because of how prominent the new Wrath of the Lich King human racial, every man for himself, had quickly become, but I remember back in the days of Wrath, all the other kids would make fun of me in Wintergrasp when they'd be bitching about every man for himself, and I'd interject that honestly, Arcane Torrent was low-key way better than the free trinket. Anyways, it seemed that my take on things was simply not the publicly accepted opinion for a while, but I suppose it was only a mere 8 years later when Legion hit and people suddenly realized, for whatever magical reason, that hey, maybe an AoE 2-second silence is actually broken as fuck. I love Arcane Torrent, and it's the biggest reason why I've remained a Blood Elf after I originally made my rogue way back in Wrath of the Lich King just to experience the Blood Elf starter zones. I'm really going to miss it when they change it, and I do recognize the slight irony that now that people finally agree with me that Arcane Torrent is broken as hell, it's getting a change and sort of a nerf. Essentially, the reason that it took so long for people to recognize the power of Arcane Torrent is for a few different reasons. First was because originally Arcane Torrent wasn't nearly as powerful as it is now because it was gated behind Mana Tap. Second was because when they removed Mana Tap, they also added Every Man for Himself, a racial that became the poster baby for broken PvP racials. A more distant third reason, I think, is also because Blood Elves couldn't be warriors until Cataclysm, and while they could be all the other popular PvP classes like Rogue, Mage, Priest, and Hunter, the fact that no high-end warrior PvPers were playing Blood Elf for a while probably didn't help spread the truth of Arcane Torrent's power. I'd imagine that the primary reason that Arcane Torrent suddenly became the best racial in the game come Legion was mostly due to Mythic Plus, because when you're pushing those Mythic Pluses, that AoE silence really budgeted very well, both for doing bosses and for controlling trash, which was primarily the big thing in Mythic Plus. So I think just its notoriety in Mythic Plus just helped it carry over, and people began realizing how good it was in PvE. And then the PvPers came out and they're like, yeah, actually it's really good for PvP. So then everybody just accepted that it was good for PvP, and then everybody became a Blood Elf, and they all just had a fucking orgy. They were all just squirting at each other, Arcane Torrents all over the place. I would guess that's basically how it all went. It's sort of funny because for a while, Arcane Torrent was only receiving buff after buff. Hell, at one point, they even lowered its cooldown by 30 seconds. Holy shit! The new Arcane Torrent is going to purge a random buff off of enemies, which may not be as immediately powerful as a 2-second silence, but I do think it'll have very niche and clutch uses that will, if history is any indicator, probably be underappreciated for about a decade or so before it's eventually picked up and popularized before being fucking changed again. There's also other racials in the game that are low-key powerful, and I wonder if they'll see some raise in popularity with Arcane Torrent being changed. Hoof Stomp for Torrents is an 8-yard AoE 2-second stun, which even with its brief cast time is arguably even more powerful than Arcane Torrent is. It'll be interesting to see how players react to the Arcane Torrent change and what racials, if any, may rise to take its place. Anyways, so there you go. Okay, bye.